This video is brought to you by Nebula. On Thursday, voters in the Scottish constituency of Rutherglen and Hamilton West went to the polls to elect their new MP in a much anticipated by-election. The election was always going to be a two-horse race between the SNP and Labour, who used to dominate in the area and are enjoying a bit of a resurgence in Scotland at the moment. Most commentators expected a relatively close race, but as the results rolled in the early hours of Friday morning, it became clear that it was a Labour landslide. And in the end, Labour won nearly 60% of the vote, 30 points ahead of the SNP and an astonishing 55 points ahead of the Tories, who won less than 5% of the vote and embarrassingly lost their deposit. It's hard to overstate quite how good this result is for Labour. Not only did they win by a massive margin, but this result also suggests that Labour could be on their way to reasserting their political dominance in Scotland, which felt pretty much impossible only a couple of years ago. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the by-election results, why they're great news for Labour and terrible for both the Conservatives and the SNP, and what this all might tell us about the upcoming general election. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. Rutherglen and Hamilton West is a predominantly urban constituency in the west of Scotland that lies just on the outskirts of Glasgow. While the more central parts of the constituency around Cambuslang are relatively well off, the northern and southern parts of the constituency are some of the most deprived parts of Scotland. For context, Glasgow is one of the most deprived cities in the UK, and some of its poorest areas are amongst the worst in all of Western Europe. To illustrate, Glasgow as a city has a life expectancy of just 76, well below the UK average of about 81, and the district of Carlton, which lies just north of Rutherglen, has the lowest life expectancy in the UK at just 72.2, a bit lower than Bangladesh. Things are particularly bad for men. According to the latest data we could find, Carlton has an astonishingly low male life expectancy of just 67.8, lower than Iraq. Historically, Glasgow and the surrounding areas have been Labour strongholds. Rutherglen and Hamilton West was only created as a constituency in 2005, but its predecessor seats, Glasgow Rutherglen and Hamilton South, were both continuously Labour from 1970, and Labour won Rutherglen and Hamilton West by about 40 points in both 2005 and 2010. In 2015, however, the SNP MP Margaret Ferrier flipped the seat for the first time, before narrowly losing it back to Labour in 2017 and then winning it back with a 5,000 vote majority in 2019. A year later, Ferrier was kicked out of the SNP for breaching COVID regulations after it was alleged that, despite exhibiting COVID symptoms and taking a test, she still decided to travel from Scotland to London, before receiving a positive result later that day. In 2021, she was arrested and charged by Police Scotland for the incident, but she nonetheless decided to continue as an independent MP. Earlier this year, the Standards Committee finally got around to considering her case and recommended a 30-day suspension, which was promptly approved by the Commons. Under the Recall of MPs Act 2015, any suspension over 14 days triggers a recall petition, and if 10% of constituents agree with the petition, then a by-election is held, which is exactly what happened to Ferrier. Most analysts expected the by-election to be a relatively close affair, both because Scotland-wide polling suggests that Labour and the SNP are pretty neck-and-neck at the moment, and because at the local elections in May 2022, the SNP won the wider Lanarkshire Council election by a similar margin to 2017, and a majority of wards in the constituency. Unfortunately for the SNP, that's not quite how things panned out. Labour won 58.6% of the vote, up from 34.5% in 2019. The SNP came second with 27.6% of the vote, down from 44.2% in 2019, and the Conservatives came third with just 3.9% of the vote, down from 15% in 2019.
This is a massive result for Labour. Not only is this the first time they've beaten the SNP at a by-election, but the margin of victory suggests that they could plausibly win a majority in Scotland at the next election. If these results were translated to a general election, Labour would win something like 45 seats in Scotland, with the remaining 14 or so going to the SNP and the Tories winning zilch. While by-election results probably shouldn't be used as national barometers, and 45 seats does seem a bit steep, the scale of Labour's victory here at least suggests that they're on track to win quite a few seats off the SNP at the next general election. And this is really phenomenal news for Labour, because the loss of Scotland in the past decade or so has been perhaps the worst thing to happen to Labour's electoral prospects in modern history. For context, until 2015, Scotland reliably voted Labour, and this always gave Labour a 40 or so seat lead over the Tories at general elections. Once Scotland started voting SNP in 2015, however, an outright Labour majority in Westminster looked increasingly difficult, not just because they didn't have Scotland, but also because, even if they liked Labour more than the Conservatives, many English voters were reluctant to vote for Labour for fear of a Labour-SNP coalition and all the constitutional chaos that could accompany it. Just a few years ago, the SNP's immense popularity and strength of pro-independent sentiments in Scotland made it look like the SNP's success in Scotland had become a permanent feature of UK politics, which is another reason Labour's resurgence in Scotland is so remarkable. Conversely, this is terrible news for the SNP, which has been struggling with a series of scandals recently involving their internal finances and former leader Nicola Sturgeon, who was one of the most popular politicians in Scotland. Unfortunately for the SNP, her successor, Humza Yousaf, has a net approval rating of -12, 4 points behind Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar, and most Scots are unhappy with the way the SNP has been handling its devolved responsibilities. While national polling suggests that the SNP were still doing relatively well despite all this, Thursday's results will make the SNP anxious that their support is softer than it was under Sturgeon. Finally, this was also a terrible night for the Conservatives. Obviously, no one expected them to do well, given their immense unpopularity in Scotland at the moment. But winning less than 5% and losing their deposit is an immense embarrassment, and really bodes very badly for the Scottish Tories' chances at the next election.
That's all we have time for today, but if you're the kind of person who wants to dive deeper into the more technical and analytical side of these stories, then you ought to check out the Daily Discussion, where our writing team are let loose to discuss stories just like this one, diving deeper into news stories and unpacking the hidden details that they found fascinating, but they're either too long or too academic to make it into the final script. If you want to check them out, you can find them exclusively on Nebula. And the best news is that Nebula is less than £2 a month and provides you with ad-free and exclusive videos from TLDR and a ton of incredible content from other creators like Johnny Harris, Real Life Law, and Legal Eagle. Check it out by clicking on the link in the description and make sure you use our link so they know that you came from us.